guys, this is like the 4th time I've recorded this video, so that's fun. Welcome back to my normal recording space and a kind of normal situation. It's post-holidays, we're gonna get back into things, and today I'm gonna talk about violence. I wanted to talk about this because this is a conversation people both want and don't want to have. People love ascribing meaning to violent video games, and hey, I was one of those people. I was like really obsessed with it. I wrote essays about it and everything. It was like the whole thing. And I kind of still am to a much lesser extent, but we'll get into that. That's kind of what the whole video is about. This conversation about the harmful effects of violence in the media, because oh yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. Hey, it's something that's come up in world conversation recently, and I don't really know why. Every time someone brings it up, it feels like it's come out of nowhere. And when they do bring it up, it feels like it's for a completely nonsensical reason. But that doesn't mean it's not worth talking about or dismissing it outright, because some people clearly don't know what they're talking about. It's a much more nuanced problem than some people would like to make it out to be. I'm a pretty extreme pacifist, so I understand that I come at this topic with a pretty extreme bias, but I feel like when people condemn violence in the media, they do it for the wrong reasons, and they highlight the wrong harmful effects that might not be actually empirically measurable. I want to talk about glorification and romanticization for a minute, because it's something I hear a lot in the social discourse right now, specifically when it comes to dramatic media. Sometimes it's the glorification of violence or romanticization of toxic relationships or harmful behaviors. And to be honest, in certain topics, I have found myself in the past not quite knowing what that means. And so this is kind of a clarification exercise, both for myself in writing the script and for anybody who might not really know why we talk about it or what's going on and stuff. For example, I feel like every once in a while, I'm not always sure what people mean when they say something's being glorified in a specific movie or TV show, especially if that movie or TV show seems to explicitly condemn the violent action being taken. It's described as a glorification seemingly because it's just there. Now, I'm not saying that these people are wrong to say it's being glorified. I'm just saying that sometimes I miss these things. I know my mind doesn't make these connections all the time, and so it's understandable why some people might think that a specific violent act is normal, or something that feels like a progression of the natural story as it goes on, something that makes sense, right? But what I want to talk about here isn't that. I'm essentially making my academic career out of pointing out glorification and romanticization of violent and toxic behaviors in historical and hopefully one day modern media. That's kind of what this YouTube channel is. It's a way for me to explore how to examine these things for modern media so that one day I can do it in a more academic way, which is also why this video is a little bit more academic than some of my other videos. But you know what, it's fine, because it means that I got to write it in advance and I don't have to worry about messing up all the time, even though I will inevitably do that. What I mean is, something might be condemned, but the glorification might still be subtle. What I'm saying is you might not always agree with me when I say something is being glorified, and that's fine. You know, that's up to you. I just want to talk about trends I've noticed, times I've seen these trends bucked, and what this means both for the media we consume and for what it might do in our minds. Mother, this is why you don't drink tea in your videos, Amelia. So I want to start this video out with a trigger warning, and I know people have morphed and twisted this word into something that people tend to make fun of, and that's not great. This is a real psychological term that I really want to put out there, because this video will include discussions of domestic violence, sexual assault, self-harm and suicide, and toxic relationships. So if you feel like you will be too uncomfortable hearing about those topics, viewer discretion is advised. So we've gotten better as a society in identifying what behaviors are toxic. The overwhelmingly negative reaction to the 50 Shades franchise is testament to that. But that doesn't mean that other behaviors still aren't glorified. Let's talk about some violence. Story time. I haven't done story time for a while. Story time. When I was a kid, I was like really super terrified of guns. I mean, I'm still afraid of guns. Who isn't? they can kill people. I had to be pulled out of my first grade class because we were watching a documentary on police and they had guns in their holsters, and I was so afraid I started like crying in the middle of class, and yeah. So for years I wouldn't watch anything that had guns in it of any kind. So I was pretty sheltered as a kid because violence was just something that I couldn't handle watching. I didn't like being confronted with my own mortality. So the first movie that I watched finally steeled myself up, and I was like, the plot sounds interesting, the plot sounds interesting, is a movie from I think 2009 called Push, which stars Chris Evans. And, you know, it wasn't as bad as I expected, and I started watching more things. But the reason I tell this story is that there was definitely a transition from when I thought that violence was never acceptable to when I fucking love superhero movies with a passion. I love it. They're so good. But let's look at superhero movies for a quick second, because they're like the most popular things in movies right now. We love action movies. They all have a violent confrontation at the end. We have movies like John Wick, Mr. Right, The Revenge, anything by Quentin Tarantino, who people go to see specifically for the over-the-top, bloody, gory violence and things like that. We like watching those movies. We like the violent showdowns. And this is badass behavior, we're cheering them on, but these people are still winning the day through violence. Characters might angst over having to use violence. For example, Sam in the early seasons of Supernatural, who was portrayed as a sweet boy who didn't want anything to do with his brother and father's ultra-violent life and was yanked into it against his will. And for several seasons, we saw him struggling with having to use violence or kill even monstrous characters, whether within the story these characters deserved it or not. But it's still portrayed as the right decision, and we love watching these these action scenes because we think it's cool. Does this mean that I now think you're going to go commit murder because Captain America picked up Thor's hammer and it looked cool? No, that's ridiculous, and there's absolutely no science to support that. But I mean, there are my anecdotal experiences of children hitting each other because they saw a Ninja Turtle doing it and they didn't understand that it was wrong. Or there's the case of Lionel Tate. I bring this story up because when I was a kid, I was like super obsessed with it. I know way too much about this case. Tate was the youngest person ever to be sentenced to life in prison at only age 12. And he attributed his violent murder of his young cousin to imitating televised wrestling. This account of the murder has been questioned over the years, and Tate has been in and out of prison for violent crimes ever since his conviction was overturned and he was put on probation in 2004. But it did spark a massive conversation about violence in the media and its effect on our mind. And it's not just this. Violence in the real world has forced people within the media sphere to confront violence within their own projects. Jim Carrey denounced the gun violence in Kick-Ass 2 following the Newtown shooting in 2012, and the release of Django Unchained was similarly postponed for the same reason. Stanley Kubrick famously refused to release A Clockwork Orange in his native Britain for fears of copycat instances of violence. Just this past year, the LAPD increased security for the release of The Joker, fearing that both the film's violent content and the Batman franchise's association with the 2012 Aurora shooting might result in further violence. So this next section is going to talk about instances of sexual assault. I know I trigger warned this at the beginning of the video, but I need to reiterate that this next section is going to describe violent and graphic depictions of sexual assault. Though I will not discuss these events in detail, it will bring up uncomfortable and disturbing topics, so if you aren't comfortable with that, skip to the timestamp below. So this is one of my things, one of the major points of things that I study, and I do plan to do a separate video on the topic, but I do think it's worth talking about in the context of glorified violence because it's become part of the discourse recently as to whether the use of sexual assault for dramatic purposes is exploitative. Now obviously, it is. If you use sexual assault for dramatic effect, you're going to run into exploitative territory. Both Game of Thrones and 13 Reasons Why have been criticized for this. Game of Thrones is famous for turning scenes that weren't depicted as sexual assault in the books into scenes that are clearly sexual assault, such as Daenerys' first experience with Khal Drogo and Jaime and Cersei's thing next to their dead son's body, which just gross. In the case of the latter, the showrunners tried to claim that this event actually was not assault, and that despite her resistance, Cersei actually wanted it. But what does this resistance say about how we approach consent in violent sex? It's less about sending the message that we should commit violence and more about how it normalizes the violence. Game of Thrones was also criticized for increasing the level of violence against a character who was assaulted. This character is not assaulted in the book, but the scene can be seen as justified because the character, Sansa's storyline, was combined with the character who was assaulted in the book. The difference comes in Theon Greyjoy, or Reek, being forced to watch the assault take place. This was an addition that was unnecessarily cruel and refocused the narrative from Sansa's being sold to a monster by someone she thought she could trust to the voyeuristic horror of watching a sexual assault, similar to the Singing in the Rain scene in A Clockwork Orange. Nothing, though, can compare to The Descent, a film which features a woman who, in revenge for being raped, tricks her rapist into being tortured and violently raped by another man, specifically a large black man, in an act which is framed as both desirable and justifiable for his actions towards her. Despite the incredibly problematic implications that this punishment has for both the LGBTQ and black communities, and yes, I say problematic with the knowledge that this is a gross understatement, this is an overly glorified, sickening depiction of sexual assault that asks you to cheer on the assaulters. She gets satisfaction from the violence, and the man doing the assaulting clearly takes pleasure in doing so. We hear the victim's screams, we see his face, we feel his pain in a way that we never felt hers during her own assault at the start of the film. It's disgusting, and it goes too far in a very obvious way. The scene is drawn out, it's nearly 20 minutes long, and it's set up like a normal revenge trap until things start to get violent. Both the fact that the character is being assaulted by a man and the man's size and race, specifically the implications that a large black man must also have a large and therefore extra painful penis, are emphasized to make the punishment even more brutal to the victim. This is a voyeuristic, supposedly satisfying and cathartic scene shown through intense images of violence and violent assault. I say supposedly because it's honestly disgusting, and I couldn't get through it without looking away for several minutes at a time, hoping that, it would just be over, and then it just wasn't, and it kept going, and honestly, it's one of the worst things I've ever seen. And normally I would say this could be used to teach us how not to depict sexual assault on film, but no, I'm telling you right now, do not ever watch this film. Ever. Now let's compare these depictions to that in 13 Reasons Why. Now, I'm not here to claim that we should hold 13 Reasons Why up as an example of how to depict sexual assault. The show has been criticized in every season for glorifying, romanticizing acts of violence, specifically suicide and sexual assault, in ways which should not be ignored, especially, for example, Tyler's assault in season 2, which was unnecessary and wasn't even in the context of the original story, but was added by the show's writers to infuse more drama into a story that had technically already ended after season 1. And that doesn't even mention the violent and graphic suicide scene in season 1. But for me, the assault scene with Hannah was vindicating. It was validating. People I know who read the book criticized Hannah for not fighting back, blaming her for what happened because she went limp and did nothing. It was difficult in the book, clearly, to get across how this violation might feel to the victims, but the show focuses on her perspective, never showing anything other than her face or her hand, as you can see that she just feels dead inside, and it just describes the feelings of so many victims. It's validating to see for some, but these lines are blurry because the same scene was extremely triggering for others. In 2015, the American Psychological Association found that watching violent media can both increase the proclivity for aggressive behaviors and decrease empathy for victims of violent crimes when a perfect storm of environmental factors create a predisposition for violent behaviors in the mind of the subject. Simply put, this study concludes that while violent media does not necessarily cause violent behaviors, when other factors are present, it may create a perfect storm that normalizes the violent behavior in ways which might mean they might copy it. And in 2017, the Psychological Bulletin published a study which corrected for potential bias in laboratory-based studies that found that while violent media may not necessarily increase violent behaviors, it does have a clear effect on violent thoughts. There is still an effect on the mind, whether it gives someone a hero complex or diminishes the value that they place on human life. I don't know. It can have a lot of effects. But the biggest one is how it normalizes violence. This has been extensively studied in the ways that media treats women and the effects this has on domestic violence, which is one of the reasons for the major backlash against 50 Shades of Grey and the Twilight franchises. But it has been similarly noted that images of war and dehumanization of the victims normalizes violence that both leads us to hesitate to respond or react to it because we're used to the violence and we hardly pay attention anymore, like the bombings in Syria or mass shootings in the US. Alternatively, we have seen in countless instances of genocide, such as Rwanda and in Nazi Germany, of propaganda being used both to normalize violence in the eyes of the citizens and dehumanize the victims as to make their murders easier. Media has long been used to inspire a feeling of righteousness in the eyes of the viewer. This is why propaganda films were so effective in getting people to enlist in wars, but it's also why footage of realities of war and what it's actually like in war zones had the exact opposite effect when it was used and exploited in Vietnam, and therefore led to the anti-Vietnam War movement. Now, I don't think violent media is going to make anybody a murderer, but we can't pretend that there isn't a fundamental acceptability that goes along with the glorification of violence. And this is not a new phenomenon. One of the major things that I study for my PhD is honor culture and chivalry and its effect on male-targeted media. Violence was considered not only acceptable, but expected forms of masculinity. If you were offended or slighted in any way, you were expected and encouraged to respond to that offense with a violent confrontation. This glorification of violent behaviors is seen in chivalric and romantic literature, where sword fighting is put to the forefront. If you've never read something like Thomas Malory, you might be surprised to learn that the actual Arthurian story takes a backseat to one guy coming up to a dude, fighting him, then going up to the next dude and then fighting him, and then so on and so on and so on. It's a weird circle. This was put in the media because this was what was valued in a culture of chivalry and jousting and war. And so then it was put in their stories, and then the stories made people want to participate more in it, and it just goes round and round in a circle. This is mirrored now. You know, we say sex sells, violence sells too, so people want to consume those violent behaviors. Our hunger for that means that it sells more, which means that we get more of it, and it goes round and round. Now, the evidence does suggest that while violent behaviors and violent crime do not seem to be correlated in any meaningful way to violent media, a significant correlation can be found in the ways that those crimes are committed. This is most evident in the clear and persistent statistics that show that depicting suicide in the media in a heavily detailed way, reporting on it and giving details of what happened, leads to a marked increase in suicides following the event. There's a copycat effect in the media as well, with people using film and television to inspire their own violent crimes. In 2009, a bomb went off near a Starbucks in Manhattan, which was said to be explicitly inspired by the film Fight Club. In 1998, a group of teenagers planned a scream-like killing spree, which resulted in the death of one of the teens' mothers. Natural-born killers famously influenced two major mass shootings, one in West Paducah, in Kentucky in 1997, and most famously the Columbine shooting in 1994. The film Taxi Driver, and more specifically Jodie Foster's appearance in Taxi Driver, inspired Ronald Reagan's would-be assassin, John Hinckley Jr., in 1981. The TV program Dexter has so many murders inspired by it that it can fill its own top 10 list. These copycat crimes are evidence that while on an individual level, normalizing and glorifying violence and violent acts might not have any real effect, it can lead to real harm. This doesn't mean that violence can't be used to deliver a real emotional gut punch. Compare The Descent and Revenge, another film which depicts a woman getting violent revenge on her assaulters, to You Were Never Really Here and Black Klansman. Black Klansman features almost no overt violence until the final scene depicting the events which occurred in Charlottesville in 2017, which resulted in the death of Heather Heyer. You Were Never Really Here, on the other hand, shows the main character's violence from weird angles, from CCTV footage most prominently. Bodies are thrown into the frame, and we don't very often see, we do see it, but less often than we would expect to see, the main character Joe actually committing these violent murders on screen. He's even shown at one point comforting one of the men that he killed as he dies, and when he finally arrives at what we think would be the final confrontation, there's nothing. The deed is already done. The violent justice Joe has spent the movie craving is ripped out from under him and from us as the audience, but that just makes it more poignant. The violence we do see leads us to this moment, and we as the viewers, like Joe, are forced to confront our expectations for violence and our odd hunger for it. Media may be an outlet for our violent impulses. We may see other people kicking ass, and therefore we don't have to. Now, I don't know if that's true. This isn't my area of expertise, but I do know that violent video games do give people a lot of catharsis. So where does that leave us? Media is based on a set of schema and scripts that we follow, which create narratives which resonate in our society. But these narratives can sometimes be harmful in how they're portrayed, and it's worth re-examining how we think in certain ways and why certain responses are portrayed as bad. Why is BlacKkKlansman ending scene so sickening? I would argue that it's the almost complete lack of violence leading up to this point. The only comparable scene is one scene in which Ronald is arrested and mistreated by a racist cop. It's the language of the film which is more violent than the action, so when we see the car flying through the crowd in its final moments, it makes you physically sick. I'm not here to say we should remove violence from our media. I love watching a final superhero showdown as much as anyone, and I feel the same catharsis in watching the villain being defeated. And when some people try to claim this type of media, especially video games, causes violence it categorically does not cause, it is our job as people with brains to make sure that we peddle the truth and not fearmonger to avoid talking about the real issues at play. Just because there's no direct causal relationship and I like it just as much as the next person doesn't mean these things aren't worth evaluating. What do we prize in our culture? What do we glorify, and what does this mean for us as a people or as a society? I mentioned earlier that violent media is often a response to a culture which puts violent behavior, especially war, in high esteem. But what would happen if we didn't value war as much as we do? If we didn't expect men to react to slights with violent aggression, and we didn't encourage violent behaviors in children? I don't know. I'm only making observations, but we can enjoy media and still approach it with a critical eye. If we can learn something from it, we should. That's that. I do like making these more scripted videos because it allows me to lay out what I want to say and in what order, and I don't necessarily have to think about it as much as I do when I bullet point. But the script is like over here, so I'm like, I just feel like it's weird. I need to figure out a better way to do this. But doing this, so if you have any more topics that you think that would be interesting for me to cover, let me know in the comments below. I've also put all of the sources that I either directly referenced or which informed this video in the description box, so you can check that out to make sure I'm not misrepresenting anything. And as usual, all of my social medias is also in the description. I do want to start updating my blogs and things more often, but this week and next week are a little bit weird schedule-wise, getting back from Christmas and all of that, but I'll try to get back into it as soon as possible. But I just wanted to say thank you all for watching, Happy New Year, and I will see you next time. Bye!